Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the last panel of the day. Glad we still have you. Everyone energized, excited? Do we need to do a seventh inning stretch? No? Okay, I'm Ben Francisco Maulbeck. I'm the president of Funders for LGBTQ Issues. I'm glad to be here with you today with a very exciting panel. I think I'm sort of an interesting person to be facilitating this last panel because I am sort of a lifelong philanthropoid. I have been to, anyone else here philanthropoid, self-identifying?
What is that?
No,
yeah,
not one?
that?
Where's Jerry has to be at least. Where? Okay, it's just me and Jerry. A philanthropoid is not a philanthropist who actually gives out money, but someone who professionally manages a grant maker, someone who does the giving out of grants for strategic impact as their profession. So that's what I am, and evidence of that is I've been to about 117 philanthropy conferences, and I have been, I love a good logic model. I get really excited about them. On the other hand, I am a Gen Xer, so I'm sort of that weird small generation that's in between the millennials and the baby boomers. And I tweet, and I've been working for social justice for many years. So I sort of feel like I'm in between. I feel connected to all these people talking about these crazy tech models and innovative models. On the other hand, I have some of that sort of, sitting back, philanthropoid, being like, yeah, but what is this really, these hybrid models? My goal is to be a bridge between, the tech-savvy Facebook activist and the stodgy old philanthropoid, since I feel connected to both of those communities. And I'm thrilled to have here three amazing panelists. Clara Brenner, the co-founder of Tumml and the CEO of Tumml as well. Chad Boettcher, the executive vice president for social action and advocacy of Participant Media. And Maz Kessler, the founder of Catapult. And they're going to talk a lot more about your work, and of course you can see the programs for more detailed biographies. So I want to, building on some of our earlier discussions, because we've had a lot of rich discussions throughout the day, I want to not do standard intros, but ask each of you to talk about two of the themes that have come up today, which is innovation and impact. We've been looking at a lot of innovative models, but then it feels like throughout the day we've also struggled with this, okay, these tools and innovations are great, but what's the goal and how do they help get us to our various goals of generating social good in the world? So I'd like for each of you to talk about what is the innovation or innovations that your work is using, and how is it that particular innovation is a good tool or feels like the right strategy to get to your goal, to get to the impact that you want to achieve. So Clara, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. Okay. So I'm the founder of Tumml. Tumml is an urban ventures accelerator. Our whole mission is to empower entrepreneurs to solve community problems in cities. We work with companies, some of whom you've seen today, so like Hand Up, which is the crowdfunding platform for the homeless. We were their first funder. Or Work Hands, which is a blue-collar LinkedIn type service. So we find companies from around the country. We provide them with seed funding, so really early stage funding, and work with them to help make sure they're building business models that are replicable, that are scalable. And I think that's really where the innovation part comes in. I think there are so many incredible community organizations out there. I've worked for some of them, and I think the thing that my co-founder Julie and I were thinking about when we started Tumml was really, how do you scale these innovations? So often you hear about cities thinking of themselves as snowflakes. Our problems are unique, our people are special, and frankly, every city is special, but your problems are not that special. Most cities have problems with transportation, with waste and resource management, with homelessness, with workforce development. And so from our perspective, we were thinking, if people are coming up with these incredible innovations in San Francisco or Austin, why aren't they scaling to Richmond and New York or Detroit, where are the vanilla plugin solutions that could work for so many cities that, frankly, are feeling a lot of the same pain points? And I think a lot of it comes down to funding. A lot of community organizations are never going to be able to achieve the kind of scale that would be comparable to a tech startup because they're never going to achieve the kind of early stage funding that's comparable. Facebook is huge because they had massive injections of external capital that allowed them to scale when they weren't making any money. And you don't see that kind of funding model exist for many traditional community organizations, most of whom are nonprofit. And so we were really interested in, when we started Tumml, thinking about how can we find ways to drive as much capital as possible towards startups that are looking to solve community problems in cities, and see if we can't pump them up to a place where they can start solving problems on a massive scale, on a national scale, on an international scale. And so from our perspective, that means starting early. That means funding the market with a lot of startups that are doing all kinds of interesting things, and really directing them towards more institutional type capital so that they can grow. And then in terms of, I think the second question was sort of measuring impact. It's interesting. So Tumml is a nonprofit, so we have philanthropic funders who expect quite a bit of detail when it comes to kind of like measuring the impact of what we do. But also we care and we're curious to see if we're actually doing the impact that we think that we're doing. So we follow up with all of our companies very regularly. When we first started off, we were like, we'll just use one of the established impact metrics that exists. Like, we'll do the B-Lab impact assessment, or we'll use like the GIN terminology. And frankly, it was an utter disaster, failure. So we had all of our companies from our first cohort go through the B-Lab impact assessment, which for those of you who are not familiar, it's the impact assessment that's created by B-Lab, which is the nonprofit behind the benefit corporation model. And all of our companies failed because they ask questions that are not tailored towards startups, like, what is your carbon footprint? And they're like, we're 2 laptops and 2 cell phones. And it's already small and it's not going to get any smaller. So they all failed. And so we ended up having to come up with our own set of metrics, some of which are frankly much more operational than I think many of our philanthropic partners had ever heard before. Like, from our perspective, more money equals more impact. Like, if a company can raise a bunch of money, that means they're going to grow. So we measure things like, how much money have you raised? How much revenue do you currently have? How many people are you employing? How many cities are you operating in? Which frankly, like a traditional investor or a philanthropic investor should care about those metrics. And those are consistent across every company that we work with. And then we create more tailored metrics that are specific to each company. So for like Hand Up, I want to know how many nonprofit partners do you have? On average, an individual on your platform, how much are they raising per month? But that's very different than the metrics that I would ask about a tech-enabled carpooling solution. Like, their metrics are totally different. So it's been interesting, a combination of more traditional business metrics and then really tailored sort of social impact metrics.
That's great. And just for clarification, so you are a nonprofit, but the startups that you fund are for-profits.
They're for-profit or public benefit corporation or hybrid. So there has to be some vehicle in which we can invest, and that in and of itself is an innovation as well. So we're basically structured as an evergreen angel fund, which is unusual. So we're a nonprofit. We invest in for-profit or businesses that have something that we can invest in, like a public benefit corporation. And any equity that we take by virtue of our investment is held by our nonprofit. So I don't personally benefit from the investments we make. The idea is that we're putting our money where our mouth is. So if some of our companies do really well, if Hand Up goes public someday, that money is going to get cycled right back out to seed more startups.
That's great, and that's interesting. That sort of addresses some of the conversation earlier about, we need a larger ecosystem, more angel investors, and that sort of thing. So Chad, how about you? What innovations are you using, and how does that match? Why are you using these tools, which in your case is film and media, to advance a particular type of impact?
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here, and thanks for inviting me. For those of you who don't know about participant media, I thought I'd give the 30-second version. It's our 10th year. We're an entertainment company started by Jeff Skoll. He was basically the first employee and first president of eBay. After he made his wealth, he decided to dedicate the rest of his life to a sustainable world of peace and prosperity. And our role in that, in his world, is to do that through entertainment. So 10 years later, about 60 films, narratives and docs, done like Lincoln and The Help and Contagion, as well as documentaries like Food Inc., The Cove, and Inconvenient Truth. And in every case, my role is basically managing the second bottom line. We're a company. So managing that second bottom line, how do these big pieces of entertainment have impact? We actually launched a cable network 2 summers ago called Pivot. So we do it through television now, and we also have a website called takepart.com, which is about 10 million visits a month, all pro-social content. So on the one hand, my group works throughout the company to campaign different content. Sometimes it's about policy change or institutional change. Sometimes we're really trying to get personal behavior change. And depending on the opportunity, we don't necessarily campaign everything. But as we've done more and more content, a big question and challenge for us was, honestly, how do we know the story's working? A lot of times we got people to do things and we didn't necessarily know why. So over the last 18 or 20 months, we've piloted something called the Participant Index. TPI essentially measures 2 things. Well, first let me tell you, it pulls a lot of data together, and then it measures more or less 2 things that we care a lot about. 3 data sources are viewership data. So we pull in viewers from all platforms, box office, TV, streaming, online, because honestly, we weren't sure where people were seeing our content. There's so many places for them to do it nowadays. And we partner with different groups on pretty much every film or campaign. So we don't necessarily own all of the content that we create by ourselves. The second is social data. So we use something called Crimson Hexagon to do a scrape of all the social media conversations around our content and connect that to issues, because we really want to understand how people are using the content kind of between each other. As an example, we supported and were part of the film The Cove, best documentary a few years ago about the dolphin slaughter in Taiji. Millions of people have joined the campaign, and by far, most of them have never seen the film. So we need to understand, when they're not seeing the story, how that story is moving in the social sphere. And then the third part of TPI is actually an audience survey. So we do a massive survey of audience members who have seen our content, and we ask them questions that, again, get to 2 things that TPI measures. Number 1 is emotional involvement in the story. Decades of media effects research shows that when an audience feels they're being sold to, you get too many facts, and you feel they're being sold to, kind of the left brain kicks in and the barriers go up. But storytelling's been a conversation today, and there's research to show that stories can be uniquely persuasive. And when you get the audience to be emotionally involved, those barriers go down, and they're more likely to act, which is the second thing we measure. We track about 20 different actions people can take, whether it's online, sending, sharing, posting, commenting, all of that, to personal conversations, whether or not you're talking to friends about the issue, all the way up to volunteering or starting your own organization. So TPI for us is a measure that we use some statistical analysis and algorithms to really understand if our stories are working. And maybe later in the conversation, we can get to the implications of that. But I wanted to show you a video. Social justice and prison reform and all that has been a big topic, I think, today. So 2 years ago, we did a film called Snitch with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. And long story short, there was a storyline where his kid was being accused of a drug crime he didn't commit. And the only way to get out of that was to snitch. And that's a big problem with young people and mandatory minimum sentences. So as a part of our campaign, we created this 2-minute video. And with TPI, we were testing different tones and tenors to have this conversation. You'll see it's a little bit more snarky. It's been seen now 500,000 times, and it's been used in advocacy campaigns in different states across the country, because we found it was 6 times more effective at getting people to take the most important action for us, which was calling elected officials, because we need those laws changed. So we'll just show the video and then talk about it in a little bit.
Great, thanks, Chad. And we'll come back to the storytelling theme in just a bit. So, Maz, I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the ways you're innovating, which will connect to some of the conversations about crowdfunding, and also why that has been an effective tool for you and the impact you're seeking around empowerment of women and girls.
Thanks. Thank you to Neo so much. I'm really grateful to be here and have the opportunity. So my name's Maz Kessler, and I designed and built Catapult with a very simple purpose to solve the problem of getting resources to girls and women's organizations worldwide. And I think when we launched 2 years ago, but when we were designing and building it 2.5 years ago, there was a clear gap for girls and women's organizations in funding. And so we wanted to build a place where people could really take action. If I could just give you kind of a quick snapshot of the world, 2.5 years ago, girls' and women's rights were really building in momentum. There were some terrific campaigns that had come out. The Girl Effect had mobilized people, online feminist bloggers and writers. Jezebel, we heard about Feministing and Jezebel earlier, were really driving engagement. Girls Not Brides was another big coalition. So there were a lot of fantastic creative campaigns really getting people up on their hind legs. And we saw a gap for taking action. So we wanted to see if crowdfunding could really fill this gap. And when we think about innovation, I think it's quite funny because crowdfunding is actually extremely old now. In internet terms, it's about 12 years old. So I don't think of what we did so much as innovative. We basically got to sit back and really cherry pick, looking at the for-profit crowdfunders, the social impact crowdfunders, what were the best features. Kiva Teams, absolutely brilliant. Donors Choose, we really took a lot from Donors Choose. And we wanted to create a place where girls' and women's rights organizations worldwide could tell their stories and seek resources and support from people around the world. Our feeling was that there was probably a gap in engagement and funds that we could leverage a really new channel of individuals actually, but also the private sector. So we built and launched Catapult, and these goals of sort of getting everybody to collaborate. But I remember I just wanted to actually talk about when I was pitching Catapult, one of the great questions we would get asked is, why do girls and women need their own crowdfunding platform? And what's the point of having that place? And just to kind of situate us in time, 3 days before Catapult launched, Malala was shot. A month before Catapult was launched, a girl in the United States in Steubenville, Ohio, was raped repeatedly. And a month after we launched, a 23-year-old physiotherapist in New Delhi was brutally raped. So having a place where the outrage that people felt about these things, where we could capture that and really give them a place to take action and support these absolutely brilliant organizations working on the front lines who need those resources so urgently. So we did that. We were very lucky to get quite a lot of foundation funding early on, enough to build the platform and launch it. And then we were again lucky to have private sector partners come in really early. So impact for us is very, very easy to talk about because all of these great organizations who are basically working on all of these issues that impact girls and women collect metrics for us. And we ask for fairly simple metrics, essentially kind of baseline impact metrics. So in 2 years, we have 36,000 girls have been able to go to school who weren't previously able to access education. We have 146,000 girls and women who've been able to access reproductive services worldwide. Empowerment, we let NGOs, by the way, completely self-describe. So we're not prescriptive. They say what they want to do. They have their programs, and we're just a mechanism, essentially, for bringing them resources for their excellent and often dangerous work. So one of the tags that NGOs describe themselves as is empowerment, and we have 146,000 girls, 122,000 girls and women have been reached through empowerment programs, and I think that includes economic empowerment and other forms. So we've already touched about 400,000 girls and women directly, and that's been in our first 2 years of operation.
That's great. So you mentioned storytelling, and so did Chad, and that has come up throughout the day. And I feel like for me, one of the themes of the day has been, we sort of know, we, the choir here, we have a sense of where we need to go, of the change we'd like to see. How do we communicate that to a larger audience? And in Piper's remarks, and in what some of you have said, storytelling has come up as a key tool. How would you say, I'd love to hear anyone jump in as you like, but what are you seeing as the big barriers to getting stories out there to moving people with stories? And how are you experimenting to overcome those barriers and get stories out there in a useful way?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, our whole premise is that a good story well told can change the world. But what we've also realized, just both as a team and with the groups that we've worked with, is it's not the story alone. You really do need support and campaigning and experts and advocacy and a lot of thought to a theory of change around it. I think some of the groups that we've worked with in the past are like, oh God, great, can't wait for that film to come out. And it comes out and they're like, hey, what happened? Like, nothing happened. To me, that's more of a failure on the campaign side. It's sort of like, I mentioned this before, it's like saying you're going to run for president and hope you win. No, you actually have to campaign it. You really do have to campaign it. We thought, or we saw, yesterday that really smart people campaigning and winning in certain districts and pulling certain levers at certain times. I worked for Vice President Gore in 2000 and ended up counting votes in Florida from, say again?
I said, God bless.
Yeah, no, it was, I mean, those were the days of what Karl Rove called his 72-hour strategy. It didn't almost matter what you did all the way up to the final 3 damn days. And it didn't matter how many people, even nationally, came out to vote. It was actually about getting the right people to vote in the right places because they knew the system. And you literally, you're driving people to the polls. So let's not forget about that when issues that we care about, that we actually have to do a lot. I mean, we know this, but there's a lot of coordinated legwork. And I think one of the threads of conversation earlier was how many of you all working on the same issue work together. And I don't think it happens enough in a real coordinated way.
So in terms of the barrier, it sounds like one for you is making those connections, making sure the film is connected to the campaign, is connected to the advocates, who are connected to each other. That needs to happen.
Absolutely, and for us, it's really about working with our partners and educating them about the role the story plays. Mm-hmm. It's not everything, but it is one really important thing, and it can be, in many ways, if it's a huge film, for example, it can serve as a watering hole for groups who have been working on the issue for decades, and then we just want to coordinate the work around it.
Maybe I could jump in and be the naysayer of the
That's
room.
Great. Yeah, let's bring the
for
skunks
once.
into the garden
Everyone's
party.
been agreeing the whole day. No, I think the philanthropic community is too much enthralled with the notion of story. I think many of the most important solutions are incredibly unsexy and are not going to make you cry tears of either joy or sadness. And so many of the solutions we work with, so like our priority is to find, identify issues that are priorities for municipalities, things like implementing universal preschool, finding ways to increase the bond rating of your local utility so it can finance needed infrastructure. Like, those are boring. Like, you think preschool and infrastructure, like, you don't think like heart-warming or distraught, emotions, but those are incredibly important solutions to implement, and entrepreneurs and innovators have a really important role to play in bringing about those types of change. But one of the biggest struggles they have is they go to impact investors who want to be moved by a story of a child or the story of, something that's going to make them physically cry. And it's very challenging for entrepreneurs in this space who are genuinely looking for meaningful, scalable solutions to some of our most pressing problems that they can't connect with the people who should be funding them because there's this expectation that there's going to be this epic story behind it or some incredible narrative of loss and redemption. And like big data solutions for water utilities doesn't have any of that. But frankly, it's probably one of our biggest challenges right now for our cities. And so I think that many of our companies have had, actually I can tell you, so our companies so far, we've worked with 17 companies to date. They've raised $15 million, and do you know how many dollars they've raised came from impact investors? Just like a guess, or like a percentage.
Anyone?
0.
Someone,
It's 0.
Someone said 0.
It's 0.
Right.
And I mean, like even Rose, so I'll take that, this is public information, so I'm not saying anything that you might not already know. She had 20 seed investors, and we were the only impact investor that participated in that seed round. If a crowdfunding platform for the homeless isn't appealing to an impact investor, like I don't know what is. And the same thing is true with so many of our solutions. They've found that they've had to cobble together money from the tech community, and that's excellent. I want them to find as much money as possible from wherever they can. But the logical first partners that I want to see supporting these companies, and that frankly we need if we really want to see the kind of movement of social entrepreneurs out there that I think we all think is important, is to have impact investors step up and seed them. And the problem is that early stage startups have no metrics. They haven't done anything yet. So, they don't have a story that's particularly emotional, and they don't have any numbers to prove to you that what they do is going to work. And so inherently, foundations don't know what to do with them. And so I think that's been a big barrier for entrepreneurs, frankly. So that was my high horse thing. Where
I think that's really interesting. In my spare time, I write and read a lot of fiction, and there's I'm a sucker for good narrative. On the other hand, even among writers, there's an idea that a great story is like the perfect baseball game, where one team is up, then the other one makes a comeback, then they go, and then the bases are loaded, then the ninth inning, it all comes down to that, this perfect sort of narrative arc that tugs at all your heartstrings. And that doesn't, that's not actually how life is. It's not always the narrative that you can put together, certainly for...
Don't get me wrong, stories are incredibly important in galvanizing people behind important issues, but in terms of actually creating effective tools, I think this is one of the biggest challenges for the civic engagement space, is there's a lot of talking about, thinking about, doing stuff, or creating tools that allow people to fetch, but there's no mechanism to actually turn that fetching into action. And so I think that is a challenge that I don't think the philanthropic community has been able to square that circle yet.
Are you going to come to the stalwart defense of the story?
Defense of the story. No, I think I see your point, and quite frankly, data and information and pretty sort of bare bones mechanics of issues are really important. But I do think we'd be remiss to overlook the power of a story, even for a mayor, a decision maker, a policymaker, anyone. We had a campaign that around a film that did $0 in the box office. It didn't even necessarily move a lot of people when they saw it. But it did move a couple of people at the FCC. And it got them to open public comment on a particular topic that then led to some social change. And if someone says, tell the story of climate change, someone earlier said it's really important who your audience is. If you want to tell the story of climate change, who are you talking to, scientists or second graders? It's a very different way to communicate essentially the same story. So I do think, I hear your point, but we fully believe and see every day that a great story, poorly told, can kind of screw you. And these things are too important to ignore it.
So
where do you fall in this story controversy?
I think I'm sort of in the middle, actually, because I think, well, first of all, having partnerships with incredible storytellers, artists, and filmmakers is superb, because their role is to frame the issue, to tell the issue if it can be told. And then the role, I think, of technology platforms like ours or others is to give people a place to take action. Very simply, is to connect them to the people on the front lines actually doing the work, whatever that is. So we can have a marriage of those things. Our experience with stories has been really interesting, because Catapult was born in the peak story period for philanthropy, when it was just story, story, story. So every day on our Facebook channels, we talk about, about global development. Look at this lovely solution. We tell the story of solutions in the kind of social context. Look, here's people, we get this. The engagement is very low. As everybody here knows, the reason that Guardian Development exists is because it's funded. It's not a demand-driven thing. But when we make short, sharp kind of, I don't want to use the word edgy, but communications pieces that separate from the actual work of global development, which I agree with you entirely, is boring, actually. When you make these kind of provocation pieces, the internet goes crazy and you break out of the bubble and suddenly you're on all the media, traditional media outlets that you want to be on. So it's really interesting, because we struggle to we do populate our social channels with the good stories of development, of solutions. But what the internet is hungry for is actually not that at all. Now, working with filmmakers is different, because their palette is magnificent and their skills are superb, and it's a longer kind of thing.
That's great, Maz, and that's a nice segue. I want to channel my inner philanthropoid skeptic a little bit and say, raise with each of you sort of some of the challenges that I've heard and some of the concerns I've heard from colleagues in the field about some of these innovative models. So for you, Maz, you said, you talked about sort of, it sounded to me like you were saying, when we put substantive stuff on Facebook, nobody really reads it, is sort of what I heard you saying.
Or
but
shares
if we put a pithy little one-liner, whatever, then it gets more attention. So, and I've heard that concern about crowdfunding. There's the famous example recently of someone raised like $1 million to make a potato salad or something. How do you struggle with that as an organization with this substantive focused on women's empowerment? Is this just fads and sexy bells and whistles?
Well, that's actually so great, because what I always forget is that to sort of think about is that there's so many kinds of crowdfunding, and we tend to talk about it as a monolith. But of course, there's for-profit crowdfunding, there's social impact crowdfunding, there's the kind of crowdfunding where one person does a campaign and just raises money, uses the technology, and there's no accountability. So what we are is partner-based crowdfunding, which is similar to, for example, Donors Choose. So all of our beneficiaries are highly vetted, highly registered. It's incredibly credible development work. And it's very different from the potato salad. They've gone through an arduous due diligence process to be part of it. And we assume that they are experts and that we don't have any interest in telling them what to do. They know their community, they know their solutions, they do extraordinary things with very little funding. So I think if you kind of differentiate between the different kinds, the potato salad falls in the sort of fun side of it, and we're kind of a bit more serious. But then I just think it's really important when you're communicating this stuff to separate the very, very serious and dangerous and difficult work that people do with often the fundraising piece, which can be more frivolous, actually, or can be more provocative. Instead of always telling all that detail, anyone who works in global development knows how hard everything is to do. And that is the work of these organizations, to do that. But communicating about issues can be much buzzier, and that enables us to get out of the bubble a bit. One criticism we've had, which I think is really good, that's come at us, is that within the kind of huge spectrum of horrendous issues that confront girls and women every day around the world, there's certain ones that are more, that pop culture likes better. Mm-hmm. So pop culture loves girls' education or child marriage, and those are huge, huge social issues that have to be dealt with. But then, of course, they're the really difficult things, for example, FGM and violence against women, and trying to get corporate sponsors for some of those, for example, is very, very difficult because they're not uplifting in solutions. So what happens is you do tend to get an interesting thing where the easier issues can sometimes receive much more attention. What we try and do is use the cover of those issues to fund the difficult, divisive, and less...
Use those as a gateway drug to
and then
funding the really hard...
The uplifting issues,
yeah.
Which are deeply serious too, of course.
So, Clara, I want to come to you, inviting the skunk over to sit between us here. One thing I've heard about hybrid models and foundations funding for-profit, I've heard folks say, that's great that there are for-profits who are doing social good work. But why should I fund that? Because they should be making money from the for-profit. They are for-profit. So I should really focus my very limited resources on funding the more traditional nonprofit organizations. What do you say to those folks?
I say no. Before we started Tumml, my co-founder and I did a big sort of study of for-good, for-profit startups, specifically using urban as the lens, because from our perspective, social impact in the US should be focused on cities. 81% of Americans now live in cities. If you want to tackle a problem and get to the most people as quickly as possible, start with the city. It's a good bet. So we found that even after normalizing for demographic factors, startups that are looking to solve community problems in cities are less than half as likely as their more traditional entrepreneurial peers to get seed funding. That is an enormous disparity. That is huge. That basically means these startups are never getting the funding they need to even get off the ground. And these are startups that I think we can all acknowledge have an important role to play in terms of finding innovative solutions to big, hairy problems. If you can figure out how to fix my dating life, like you should be able to figure out how to fix homelessness or some other equally important problem. So clearly they're not getting the funding that they need, although these companies, once they're able to get off the ground, if they are able to find that funding, can be potentially very scalable and successful. And so I think there's a really
sustainable.
And sustainable. And I think there's a really unique role within the philanthropic community to identify those innovators who maybe aren't solving sexy problems, who aren't doing a dating app, who are working on issues of infrastructure and waste management and workforce development, and get them off the ground. Like if we really do want to encourage a corporate culture in the US of socially minded, progressive companies, they have to get funding from somewhere. And so I think there's a really unique role for philanthropy to step in and do that seed funding. But as I think a number of us were talking about earlier, I think the Global Impact Investing Network identified $46 billion in impact assets under management globally, but only 3% of those assets are earmarked for seed funding. That's like nothing. I think that's $1.38 billion, which, to put that into perspective, is less than Uber raised in its last funding round by itself. Like there isn't any money out there from the philanthropic community, which basically means most of these companies can't get money from for-profit investors, and they don't know where to go in the impact space, and so they die. These startups just don't happen. And from our perspective, like seed the market, this is a numbers game. If you have 100 startups working on infrastructure, one of them is going to be successful. But we're never going to get to that place where we have a real culture of social entrepreneurship here in the US unless we have some really forward-thinking, philanthropically minded people who are going to seed the market, which again is like not a sexy thing. This is our specialty at Tumml, not sexy things. But it's really important. I think there's a really unique role right now for philanthropic funders to step in and really change the way we think about entrepreneurship in the US.
It's really interesting because there's so much talk about these hybrid models and such. I think though it's one of those things in philanthropy and in other areas where there's a lot of talk, but it hasn't necessarily led to dollars yet, which is something that surprises me. So Chad, your turn with the skunk. One thing I've heard about funding media as sort of a tool, and especially those increasingly, I think we've seen some funders venture into this territory of saying, we want to convince people how to do things. We want to move people to action. Why don't we do what corporations have been doing for years, what Hollywood does so well, and just put it out there in the form of movies and television? Let's fund East Los High, which I love that show. Oh my God. It's a very innovative thinking, and there's excitement about that. But then I've also heard a lot of sort of trepidation, like, oh, I'm going to fund propaganda, and who gets to decide what the messages are and what the values are that are being driven? And am I creating something where there's not enough accountability and those sorts of things? So how do you answer that, those naysayers, Chad?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. For us, starts with our mission as a company from Jeff, a sustainable world of peace and prosperity. So there are big topics that he wants us to tackle: education, health, climate change, pandemics, and there are huge stories that we think can impact those ideas. So I see Mark Silver out here. An amazing storyteller. He's going to have an amazing film coming up in 3.5 minutes about Jordan Davis in Florida. It's not coming out in 3.5 minutes. It's coming out, yeah, right. What we do is within the sort of framework of huge issues that really plague the world, we know stories like Mark's can make a difference in this case around the role of race in criminal justice and policing and all of that. It's a topic we have to address. So we stand behind the filmmaker, we stand behind the storyteller to address it, and then our job is to actually help campaign it. So I think if you were to ask everyone at Participant whether or not we believe in the story that Mark's telling, it doesn't matter. I would say we probably do. But we don't all have to agree with every single part of every story. But we think and we know that these stories do matter, and we're going to bring it to the world's attention or to influencers' attention and see if we can make something a little bit better.
It almost sounds like, we talk about democracy sometimes is a free market of ideas, it almost sounds like you're trying to just expand that free market a bit overall.
Right.
I mean, hearing that, especially in that last part where, you know, I'm not sure, we don't necessarily all believe in every single little thing, because you wouldn't want that sort of lockstep.
Right, and there are, you know, people on all sides of issues are really smart about what they're putting in their messaging and where they're putting it and how they're campaigning it. So I'm demanding of our team and of our, you know, our social action group and, you know, working with our filmmakers that we do the same. I think we're obligated to.
Really interesting. So I'm going to do one final lightning round before we open it up to all of you for questions. And this, you know, we're supposed to be talking about the future. So this is where we get to play the McLaughlin group. And I'm going to go.
You have to talk like him.
Oh, okay.
It's hard.
So, predictions. Clara, what will happen in the next 3 years that will affect the social change landscape in which we all operate?
Oh my God.
Am I as scary?
It's terrifying. It's terrifying.
Wait, you're not as scary as the voice of God guy up there.
That's true.
Wherever he is.
That's definitely true. I think it's a combination of things. I think that we're going to start to see more traditional institutional investors take a second look at social impact and this idea that prioritizing something social doesn't necessarily mean lower return. I do think we're moving in that direction. I think we would move there a lot faster if philanthropy would step in and start seeding that market. I think we're never going to achieve the kind of like super scalable social impact companies unless we inject a lot of capital into that space, and I think inherently that's going to have to come from philanthropy. So my hope is that that is the direction we move in.
Thank you. Chad Boettcher.
I have 2 words, probably big data. I think it is a really fascinating place. We're getting reams of data through TPI. By the end of the year, we'll have reviewed 100 different forms of entertainment, long form, mid form, short form, online, offline, in theater, streaming, and it is overwhelming how much we're not able to get through, but I think we're starting to see patterns about how people experience entertainment in theaters versus streaming. Does that get them to take different kinds of actions? Do females versus males experience entertainment differently when it's on different subjects, on different platforms? And I think big data is going to help us collectively understand better the kind of impact we can have, and then better distribute our content and stories and campaign it.
Excellent. As Kessler, predictions.
I think in the next 5 years, 2.5 billion smartphone users worldwide are going to come online. And to me, that's the most incredibly exciting thing, because we're going to hear about solutions to the world's problems from everybody all around the world. And access will be so increased that the Einsteins of their communities, girls, women, boys, men, everywhere, will have full access to the kind of markets and the kind of shared information that we now have. And that's a huge, it's 2.5 billion people will have smartphones. So I'm pretty excited about that. And for the girls and women's space, I think the big social piece for us is that boys and men will become increasingly involved in our issues, and they'll be shared by all of us, and it will no longer be girls and women's movement, but a justice movement.
So this is where I'm supposed to say you're all wrong.
Right.
But actually, I think you're all right. I think I share your optimistic views. So let's turn it over to you. What questions do you have for our panel? Yes, you, sir, and then in the back.
Michael Hickey, Man About Town. Really enjoying the conversation. I think as much as it's appealing sometimes to kind of critique our colleagues in the philanthropic sector, the challenges that I see around social impact investment and adopting tech innovation seem kind of parallel, in that you can have a program officer who really is deeply knowledgeable about early childhood education or affordable housing or healthcare among high needs diabetic patients, but doesn't really know very much about tech writ large, or doesn't understand how to analyze a credit. So how do you, I'm wondering if you have examples of foundations that are adopting strategies to either train their staff in greater familiarity, or building partnerships with people that can deliver that capacity alongside of the program or the resource support in order to really achieve some of the impacts that you're talking about.
Yeah, go ahead, Max.
What we see is that foundations are catching up extremely quickly. I mean, all companies are now technology companies, basically, if they're communicating their issues or, mobilizing resources in any way. And people are moving very, very quickly. And I don't see a huge gap.
I might jump in and say a great example would be Tumml, although I'm biased. I think a lot of our philanthropic partners see us as a potential source of deal flow. I think many of them have identified that they would like to make impact investing a real priority, but they may not be comfortable doing that seed stage. They may want to know more about these companies and get a chance to really get to know them and get some outside opinion on them. And so they see us as a really helpful tool to basically create a built-in pipeline of companies that they can follow along and follow their progress. But I would also say that I think many foundations that we talk to place too much emphasis on the advice that they want to give startups. They're like, oh, well, we need people in-house who can really advise these companies. And even if we can't provide them funding, like, we can provide them with really valuable feedback. And I have to tell them, no, that's not true. You don't have a lot to offer besides your money for early stage companies. You may have excellent advice at some point, but these startups are worried about whether their server is going to crash tomorrow, or where they're going to be sleeping next week, or if they're going to be able to buy groceries. They don't have time for your advice. And so even if you have stuff to offer other than money, they don't want it. They couldn't absorb it even if they did want it. And so I think this overemphasis on foundations providing really early stage consulting for nonprofits or for-profits isn't really realistic. So I think it's more about deploying small amounts of capital with relatively low barrier to entry and seeing what sticks. You build relationships with these companies, and some of them you're really going to like, and some of them you just have to acknowledge either aren't going to succeed or maybe move in a direction that you're not interested in. But it's much more about just getting that money out there, even in small increments, much more quickly.
That's really interesting to me because in some ways that's a very old model in philanthropy of, when it comes to large foundations aren't necessarily good at funding small grassroots nonprofits. So they work through, for example, groups like Philanthropy, intermediaries, to get resources out to those more grassroots groups. And this is the same model, working through an intermediary that specializes in startups. That's really interesting. Chad, did you want to?
I was just going to mention, at least from a media standpoint, the Gates Foundation has funded a number of groups, including working with us on the Participant Index. They're working with USC, I think, University of Illinois, Harmony Institute. They're funding different tools, some of which are free and open. Again, more from the media standpoint, but there are some tools out there that can help measure the impact of the media you might be investing in.
And that's interesting too, because there's also, I'm immediately putting things into categories. We have this sort of possibility of basically outsource this, work through an intermediary. We have the possibility of developing a whole portfolio dedicated to technology or dedicated to sort of hybrid model startups. Or then there's this a sort of more integrated approach, which might be harder because no matter what area you're working in, like Maz said, there is, technology is part of community organizing now. So there sort of needs to be an across the board, at least understanding of some basics that we all in philanthropy really ought to have. So next question. Yes, sir. Microphone back here.
So this is a question, I guess, for Chad.
Can you introduce yourself really quick? I know you spoke before.
Micha Sifri. So the question is about the use of the index and the data that you're collecting from it, and whether you're going to use it for predicting, like, where you should put money based on what you're learning on what works in the past. And how will you correct for the following problem? You're looking at what actions people take in response to media. And the story that came out in the Times about the Participant Index was really interesting because it showed two different movies that you had examined, right? The Square, which is about human rights in Egypt, and a movie about our diets.
Right, Farmed and Dangerous,
Farmed and
the
Dangerous.
Chipotle show on Hulu.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And both great movies. But obviously, there's a lot more that people can do personally to change their diet in a positive way than they can do to fix our foreign policy. So I'm wondering, how do you adjust for that challenge? You know, I think it's really cool what you're trying to do, but I'm also wondering, like, if participant media was using this index, say, in 1978, would you ever fund a movie challenging apartheid? Because in 1978, everybody thought, well, there's no way that's ever going to end. So how do you fix for that part of the future that we actually don't know yet, if the data you're using is just about past behavior?
Right. No, great, and ongoing question even for us. First, I'll say TPI is really, it's in its nascent sort of form, and we are, as we go, learning and evolving and changing, updating the methodology. But I would say this, that we are not using it to make funding choices on our films. It really comes out of my group, which is around advocacy and action, and really understanding how people are engaging in stories emotionally, and then the actions they take, so I can create a more effective campaign. I'll give you an example. We were doing a project with the Gates Foundation around teachers and called Teach, and it was a 90-minute made-for-television film on CBS, and now we're running a 2-year campaign, and we tested 3 different interstitial shorts about teachers. We're trying to reframe teachers and hopefully get young people to go into the profession, and hopefully current teachers that they, you know, stay in the profession. The first was a story that focused on Sal Khan, for those of you who know Sal, who's a great innovator in the Bay Area in teaching. The second focused on a series of really awesome, emotionally relevant teachers about how important the job has been to their life. And the third was a funny, celebrity-driven PSA. And by far, according to our index, number 3, they all were pretty popular. Number 3 did not inspire almost any of the actions we wanted people to take. So what I said is like, all right, we're going to shelve that, not put any more money behind it, not put any marketing behind it, and go back to the first 2. It's just honestly allowing us to be more effective with our resources in getting people to take the kinds of actions we want. Now, as we go forward, we're going to learn more, sort of topic by topic. But that's really been the intent so far in what we're doing. And by the way, we're publishing these reports at least 2 or 3 times a year, so we're sharing some of our findings. We actually have one coming out in about 2 weeks.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question. Yes, right here. Go for it.
Hi, I'm Margie Fine. I work with several of the funds at Neo Philanthropy on helping the groups with fundraising. So at the end of the day, I'm interested in what our takeaways are, and maybe Boettcher and Michelle are going to talk to this at the end. I'm thinking, are we going to, as funders, will they start now funding just not regular communications? We're just going to go online and that's the answer? Are we not going to be not-for-profits, but we're going to be entrepreneurs? Is there an entrepreneur that should be up there with somebody who's on the not-for-profit and talk about different models and when they work? Where are we now? What's this about? And when I look around the room and who's here, I think, how will we use what we learned today, which was a very positive and excellent day, going forward? So I'm almost not just asking you, I'm asking the room. Where are we now, and what does this mean to us? Are your grantees all going to change in the next year based on this? What will this mean? So thank you for this. And I want you to answer in that voice.
Any thoughts from all of you?
Maybe in response to the entrepreneurship question, like, are you going to start funding for-profits? I think many philanthropic folks that we talk to sort of say entrepreneurship is not one of the verticals that we prioritize. And my response is, that's fine. Entrepreneurship is a mechanism for change. We work with entrepreneurs in the education space. We work with entrepreneurs in the sustainability space, in the health and human services space. Like, you can focus on those themes, and it just happens to be that you're working with entrepreneurs. Like, there's a way to parse that out where even if entrepreneurship or business development isn't necessarily something that you guys have prioritized as an organization, like, you can still work with those types of individuals because they're developing really interesting tools. And so I think it's the conversation needs to move away from like how do foundations support more entrepreneurs and more like how do we find the best solutions for this particular problem that we've identified. And maybe that's for profit and maybe it's nonprofit, but frankly I don't care. Like that's not what's interesting to me. It just happens to be that we happen to focus on startups that are for profit or hybrid business models because we think there's a real gap in that market. They need funding that they're not getting, and they have a unique opportunity to attract capital that would allow them to scale in a way that a community organization will never be able to do. But that's just our priority. That's what we're interested in. But maybe you guys are interested in one particular area, and that I don't think we should be discriminating by business model. We should be discriminating on the quality of the idea.
So our approach would be as a catalytic investment. When you invest in a platform that then brings in new engagement, new funds from completely different sources, and has the possibility of scaling very, very rapidly, that can engage with the private sector, that can engage with citizens and individuals. Though that's a catalytic investment within an issue framework that can really multiply the investment. So, we do work alongside with foundations. They actually often provide us with grantees. So we're able to leverage pre-existing skills of vetting and due diligence, and it's just a way of accessing another unique income for those same organizations that really know how to put the money to use.
And then what I would say is Jeff Skoll believes that, or his hope was that in investing in storytelling, the sort of ROI, social ROI, and even financial ROI would be bigger than if he had just written a check. There's the Skoll Foundation. We're not a foundation, we're a double bottom line company. And I'm just guarantee you there are great, powerful stories buried in your organizations, in your work, in your grantees. We find them, it's hard to find them, but we find them. And just don't overlook the power and the possibility of just one story dislodging what could be a years-long battle. It's not going to work every time, skunk. But I'm telling you, it honestly gives us the greatest, and that's why we developed TPI. It's just giving us the best shot at it because they're out there.
Great. And I mean, for me, I think the theme, and what I'm hearing from all of you now is just, being open to, we definitely are filled with conventional wisdom in philanthropy. And just, being open, and some of the conventional wisdom is actually wisdom. It's important to remember that. But some of it, maybe was useful at some point, but no longer is. And let's always, be ready to think about that. What's the wisdom that really is wisdom that continues to be useful and helpful? And what are the things that maybe we can question and be open to new ways of solving problems? And I'm going to leave it to Michelle and Boettcher to do the really deep stuff. But before that, I just want to thank this great group of panelists and leaders for sharing some wisdom with us today. Thank you.